Let's kick off this encounter with a sly flourish. My guest today is game designer and writer Mike Shea.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. I know it's kind of a crazy name, but anyway, this is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. It is my mission to help game masters and role players stay sane. If you want to check out some of the RPG resources that I create, head over to dicegeeks.com. You will find them all there. I write the Books of Random Tables series, random tables that help game masters cut down their prep time and have more fun at the table. You can also find them on drivethrurpg.com or amazon.com. Just search for Book of Random Tables or Books of Random Tables. You will find them all. Today's interview is awesome. Here it is. My guest today is the writer and game designer behind Sly Flourish. Some of his products include The Lazy Dungeon Master and Fantastic Lairs, among many others. He is also a podcast host, Mike Shea. Mike, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, no problem. It's my pleasure. First off, I like to ask my guests, when were you first introduced to tabletop role-playing games?
So I probably got started with computer role-playing games. I played the gold box D&D games back in the 80s, Pool of Radiance and Curse of the Azure Bonds and whatnot. And that showed me what D&D was like. And then I got interested in it, in the mechanics of the computer game enough to go buy an actual second edition player's handbook. And I then managed to wrangle some friends together to play. This is back in high school in the late 80s, probably late 80s. And then stopped playing for a while, went to college, found a group there, and played in college for a couple of years. Then we switched over to Magic the Gathering and played that for a long time. Then I got a job, moved out to the East Coast, and met my wife. And my wife knew people who played, and so I started playing with them. And then probably about 12 or 13 years ago, we bought a house and put together, one of the things we wanted to do is have a regular D&D group. So we put together a regular D&D group, and we've been playing weekly there ever since. Plus, some other odds and ends. I have another game that I play on weekends too. So now I've been playing a whole lot of D&D over the last 10 years or so.
No, that's awesome. That is really cool. I always find it interesting how people discover the hobby. And I have actually interviewed one of the designers of Pool of Radiance on my podcast.
Oh, that's very cool. Yeah, that game
Mike
was,
Bro. Yeah,
that game is pretty fundamental. I still think about it. I still remember like the hard caliber drow guy who drank a bunch of potions and then beat your ass into the ground. Every time. That guy always, I always remember that dude.
All right. What do you think caught your imagination and stuff about role playing?
Probably the open-ended nature of it. I mean, there's something about it. There's something, it's hard. I guess it's hard to describe, but kind of grabbing onto fantasy and, probably at the time, the mix of sort of high fantasy with kind of interesting gameplay and interesting mechanics. It's not completely open-ended. It has rules that are just crunchy enough to really get interested in, and, dice probabilities. You have that sort of perfect game mixture of randomness with actual choice, meaningful choice. And that's a pretty addictive property that we see in all kinds of games these days. But also just the open-ended nature of the story. And of course, I think a lot of DMs feel this way, sometimes to their detriment of, the ability to build their own worlds and kind of bring their friends into those worlds and live them and not have any restrictions, and, no one can tell them what to do, and no limit on what they can imagine.
Yeah. And I certainly don't know any dungeon masters who try to force their friends to play through like their idea of their own novel or something like that.
Exactly. Let me tell you about my world. Right?
Yeah. I have no idea. I don't know any of those.
No, I'm sure that never happens.
Yeah, it never happens. Now, you said you bought the book and you kind of wrangled your friends, so that meant you were the dungeon master right off.
Yep, I was the DM right off the bat. Yep.
Yeah. And I know that was something I always found too, is if you owned the book, you were the DM.
Right. Pretty much. Yeah. Like there are people who are, like willing to go along. And then there are people who are like, really, really interested in it. And I think that the latter ends up becoming the DMs most of the time.
Yeah. I find that to be true as well. But now you didn't, or you weren't like really content just to keep playing. You then started publishing and writing material for the games, right?
Yeah. Probably, right around the beginning of 4th edition, right in the transition between D&D 3.5 and 4E is where I kind of got into starting to write about that stuff. But I had been, I kind of always did this though. I never, as long as I've been an adult, and since my 20s, when I would get into a hobby, I would write about that hobby. And so I wrote blogs before there were blogs about everything from home theater to fountain pens to, and then I spent a lot of time writing about the massive online game EverQuest. I wrote about EverQuest for about 6 or 7 years, including for a couple of websites that were like the big EverQuest sites of the day. Enough that the company would fly me out there and bring me around on junkets to talk to them about their game.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, so I at that same time, I got used to writing all the time. Like I was writing weekly articles back then for that. So I was kind of used to the pace. And then I would maintain that drive, but I would just switch the topic. So then when I got back into D&D, I'd already been into D&D in a big way before then. But when I kind of transitioned out of playing EverQuest, which is kind of a full-time life on its own, to getting back into D&D, I just kind of moved my lens over to D&D and started writing about that and started a blog. And that transition to 4E seemed like a pretty good time to sort of dive into it and, get some attention, right? Like not a lot of people were writing about it at the time. And I was sort of there at its earliest days when they were just testing it out. They ran 4th edition at a local convention here in DC, and I had a chance to play it. And so I wrote a Tumblr blog back when Tumblr was a thing. And about my experiences playing 4th edition for the first time. And that got a lot of attention at the time, not compared to numbers these days, but back in whenever it was, people were interested. And then, slowly, I don't know when I exactly decided it was time to go build a whole website, but I'd already been building websites. So it was pretty easy for me to fire one up and do it for Sly Flourish. Mm-hmm. And the domain name that Sly Flourish is named after a rogue power in 4th edition. And it happened to be a domain name that was free. So I went and bought the domain name, and here we are.
No, that's awesome. And I had a few friends who played EverQuest. I never really got into it, but they did disappear for quite some time.
Yeah. Well, I disappeared, but I came out with a wife. So,
oh, well, there you go.
Yeah. So I would say that it was worthwhile.
that for you, definitely.
I ended up marrying my guild leader. So it worked out.
That's awesome.
That's
awesome. Well, that explains the D&D connection as well. That's
well, I'll tell you, having a wife who's into D&D helps a lot when you're obsessed about D&D. Yeah. Like there's nobody to say like, I don't like all the time you're spending on D&D. She's like right there next to me. So
yeah, no, that's awesome. I know my wife enjoys playing every once in a while as well. So it is a lot of fun. Not having to deal with strife of somebody not understanding what you're doing, like 20-30% of the time or something like that. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And then obviously, though, your publishing has taken off quite a bit. And I did want to mention some of your books. Obviously, you have quite a few out there, and we can talk about them. But first, I wanted to talk about The Lazy Dungeon Master.
Sure.
And could you just kind of, for somebody out there who doesn't, who's not familiar, could you just kind of explain what the Lazy Dungeon Master is a little bit?
Yeah, so about, I guess it was 4 or 5 years back now. Yeah, maybe further back than that, because it was right between the transition of D&D Next. It was right around the time of D&D Next, between the transition of 4th edition and 5th edition. And I was getting out of 4th edition and kind of seeing where 4th edition how it was different than most of the other kinds of certainly variants of D&D and things like that. And I'd spent a lot of time thinking about how much work went into running a 4th edition game and how that was changing with 5th edition. And I wish I could remember like exactly where the premise of the idea came from. And I don't even think it's that unique. But there's recognition out there, and we see the jokes all the time about, I spent 3 hours on prep and my players made one left turn and everything is completely thrown out the window. And, it's such a common experience. And then you'd talk to other DMs and realize that a lot of them are saying, you don't really need to prep as much as you think you need to prep. And in some cases, the more you prep, the worse it is, because you kind of get into railroading, or you're sort of forcing situations that don't necessarily happen the way you want them to happen. And given the high structure of 4E, that was a common problem, because you sort of, 4E felt very much to me like a bunch of combat encounters, that were well defined and well set with all of these variables in them that were sort of connected with a loose sinew of story. And, but now we've got games where, anything can happen. So we're playing, the Caves of Chaos from Keeps of the Borderlands. And, all these different tables are playing it at one place. And in one table, they're like fighting the goblins. And the other one, they're fighting the kobolds. And the other one, they managed to get the goblins to fight the kobolds for them. And the other one, they are officiating a wedding between a goblin and a kobold to become the new leaders. And you're like, we're all playing the same thing, but holy cow, the situations are wildly different, and I think that sort of, getting into that idea that, that you the more you prep, the less those sort of dynamic situations are going to work. So I wrote the original Lazy Dungeon Master, and I think it sort of hit a market that people wanted it. I kind of lucked out with a title that people dug. And I offered sort of a very loose, very, very, very abbreviated framework for what you might want to prep in order to run a game more effectively, or more, easily, certainly, and maybe better than if you prescribe a lot of stuff. And that it was very popular and sold well, and I was happy with it. And then probably about 4 years into it, and I'm like, I'm not really still doing it that way. And it's pretty bad when the guy who wrote the book is no longer using the same process that he used when he wrote it. And Kickstarter had become a thing. And, I'd already run, I guess, two Kickstarters at that point, I think. Maybe 3, I can't remember. And so I was used to using Kickstarter, and I was like, maybe it's time for an update on this. Maybe it's time to write a new one. And I'm like, but I'm going to break it. Like, people already like the old one. Why would I write a new one? But there was like a couple things where I'm like, it bugs me that this isn't in it, right? It bugs me that I'm now seeing people play differently. I ran these massive polls with 6,000 DMs and learned a lot more about how people are playing. And I also recognized that there were like holes in the process that a lot of people filled with their own stuff. So it's like, well, what are they filling it with? And is that more useful? So I was also at a good point in my career where I could take a month off from work and just spend the entire month working on a new book. So I did. And I wrote Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, and I kickstarted it, and the Kickstarters did very, very well, very, very well for what I was expecting, more than 6,000 backers. And I, spent a lot of time reading every book I could. I read every Game Master book for every fantasy RPG I could get my hands on. And I read every advice book. I read all the kobold guides. I read everything that Gnome Stew put out, and watched every video I could find. So I really, because I had a month, where this is all I was doing. And so wrote the book, and the Kickstarter did well enough that we also wrote another book along with it called the Lazy DM's Workbook, which is sort of like the book that, is sitting on your table while you're running your game. And that did very well, way better than the original one did. So I was glad I did it. At first I was like, I'm going to kill all my sales. My worst case. And I remember talking with my wife about it on our walks. And I'm like, the worst case scenario is I put it out and it confuses the market and I don't sell either of them. Right. Like now I've managed to kill the sales in the old one, and no one wants a new one because no one can understand why there's two, and I still get the question of like, well, which one should I buy? If I can only buy one, I'm like, buy Return. Like, it's got everything in it, but if you buy both, you won't be disappointed. And, both of them work, but they're not, you don't need the first to read the second. and really the second one stands well on its own.
Mm-hmm.
And that has continued to be a popular book, and I see it come up a lot of times. I kind of surf and Reddit and hang out in the Ask a GM or the DM Academy Reddit subreddits, and people will say, hey, how do I prep for DM? And I'm quickly like there to write stuff, and then somebody always said, oh, I should read the Return of Lairs Dungeon. So I'm like, okay, my job here is done. Or I'll be like, thank you for pimping my book for me, so I don't have to do it myself. But yeah, so there's that. It's nice to see that people are starting to pick up, and a little scary because it's like, I don't know if it's the right answer. I think it is. It seems to work for people, but there's lots of different ways to cut this, to cut at this approach. And so I'm always a little worried. I never, in the book, I have a whole chapter that's like this, this may not work. I think it's an idea that's worked for a lot of people, and it works certainly for me, but it may not work for you. And you should be able to hack it up however you want. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know exactly what you're talking about when you say kind of prepping or over prepping can lead sometimes to a worse result when you're at the table, because I learned that the hard way by spending hours and hours in prep and then coming to the table and having terrible sessions. And then
yourself wrote the book No Prep Game Master.
I did.
Clearly we're on the same wavelength on this.
Yeah, I absolutely did, because I just kept noticing if I prepped, the session went poorly. If I didn't prep, it seemed to go better, and people had a little bit more fun. I had more fun, certainly. So, So now maybe we can talk really quick just about what would be like, to start us off, like for some DM advice. What would be like the one tip that you just want to tell every dungeon master?
I probably writing down 10 secrets and clues as part of your prep. And I bring that up because there's lots of advice that may be better than that, but you'll hear it from almost everyone. And this is one that I see people talk about it and they seem to resonate with it. And it was the reason I wrote Return that separated it from the original, was that I found that a really, really refined way of doing your game prep is to think about 10 things that your characters might learn in the next session you run. And that it narrows it down in a few ways. Like, one is it gets you to focus on your next session. You're not building out a giant world. You're just, the only game that matters is the next one you're going to run, right? And you don't have to worry about the one 5 sessions from now, because it'll fix itself when it becomes the next session. And so it gets you to focus on your next session. It gets you to focus from the character's point of view and thinking what matters to them, what will matter to them. So you're keeping your characters in mind, and therefore you're keeping your players in mind, and you're not writing a bunch of stuff for yourself. You're writing things that will be practical to them. It can cover a pretty wide range of things. So it could be everything from a little tidbits of history, or interesting information about the location that they might be in. It can be secret plots that the enemies are up to. It could be little information about the gods. It could be clues to treasure. You can kind of put everything in there, but they're still these like tweet-sized, refined bits of stuff. And then the other super valuable thing about them is that you don't say where they're going to find them. So it falls nicely into this envelope of preparing to improvise, which seems oxymoronic, but isn't. And if you write down 10 secrets and clues without defining where they're going to find them, you can drop them in during the game whenever it makes sense. And you can drop them in many different ways. So they might learn from a goblin about the history of the location. They might scrub the wall and see an old fresco on the wall that's showing the information about the location. They may pick up a magic item that has some little bit of intelligence and tells them. They might have a dream, or they might remember an old thing they read in a book back when they were in training. So there's so many different ways they can learn those secrets that they're very flexible. It works really well for mysteries too. If you're running a mystery, the clues are all the things that would lead you to learn the solution to the mystery, but it doesn't matter what they investigate. Eventually they'll get there, right? Eventually the enough clues will come to light that they'll be able to figure out what was going on, which means, the big problem with running mysteries in RPGs is you don't know what they're going to investigate. Well, in this case, it doesn't matter what they investigate. They can still potentially learn the same things. So I think that it's, there's also something just great about writing down 10 things. Like I love, and I'm sure you do too. And as a guy who has many books full of hundreds of things, that sitting down and writing 10 things is a really interesting brainstorming activity for just firing up creative thought, and I do it now for all sorts of things. I'll do it for locations and monsters. And every time I'm like, not sure what I should be working on, I'm like, well, what are 10 places they might find in the valley? Or what are 10 factions that are currently, struggling in the city? And just those sort of listing 10 things, but that list of 10 secrets and clues really helps me with prep. And I have found people that have really resonated with that idea and like it a lot. And I think it's one of the things I have that's sort of unique in the, unique in this space, in the whole helping people to learn how to GM better.
Yeah. And I think it's a great idea. And you are absolutely right that it is. Sometimes you just need something to kind of get your mind going and thinking creatively about different, situations or, objects or, secrets or clues that you just need that little spark to kind of get those going and then, react to your players and see where they're going. Yeah. And so I can see why that would be good. Really helpful. And I think you are correct as well that I don't see a lot of people talking about that one. So that is a really good tip. I'm thinking too, actually right now I'm taking a little break from GMing, so I'm getting to play some.
Cool.
Yeah. And just thinking about that as well, I mean, you probably see them too on Reddit every once in a while, posts from game masters who've been running sessions, like for, every week for 3 years, and they're about ready to, say they're done with Dungeons and Dragons and leave the hobby, and they're about ready to do all this. Yeah. What do you have any advice for somebody avoiding that kind of burnout?
Not really, because I haven't felt it myself.
Okay.
I haven't. I don't know. It's not coming from arrogance. I've been DMing. I DM a lot, right? I DM like 2 to 3 games a week, and have now for years, right? And I haven't felt that burnout. So I guess obviously, like if one feels burnout, they feel burnout, right? And that should be accepted. And this isn't a mandatory thing. And there's no problem at all with taking breaks. And there's, it's healthy, right? Like anybody that's feeling stress over it should really investigate that before feeling like they have to keep carrying on. But it's probably also worth looking at where the stress is coming from. Is it players? Is it too many players? Is it the wrong players? Is it or not a good fit of the players? Is it the amount of time and energy? I mean, the reason I got into this whole lazy DM racket was because I got busy and lots of people are busy, and recognizing that one of the most common complaints about DMing is how much time it takes. And so like, let's attack that, right? Let's figure out how to make it easier. There is this idea that D&D is DMing is hard, right? And it's not like setting up a board game. It's not like you have your friends over and you go grab a board game off the shelf and you set up the pieces and play. There is more work from that. So it's like, well, how do you get it as close to that as you can, right? How do you get it where it's really just like, wow, I've never played any of this before, and I'm going to open this box and run a game. And I think like the D&D Essentials kit got pretty close, right? Like I've run the adventure in there, and obviously I'm probably not the best sample, the best representation of it, but I didn't prep that at all. Like I ran it online, I streamed it online, and I didn't prep. I just, whatever came. And the way the adventure was written is that it supported that pretty well. But I think like trying to break it down to that, what's the easiest we can make it so that people can play, is a hard struggle, and something that I've been really trying to get to. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's fine. No, that's a very good answer, because, I've thought similar things, and you mentioned my book, and I talk about it a little bit in there. It's just, especially years ago, especially when I was a teenager playing, I could have said, hey, who wants to play D&D like today, right? And I would have probably gotten like 2 to 4 players. But if I said, who wants to be the DM?
You get nobody.
Nobody. Yeah. Right. So that is kind of that was some of my tip offs when I was younger, and I didn't realize, because I started DMing pretty quickly when I discovered Dungeons and Dragons, and it was just like, that was kind of my tip off that it's like, oh, I thought the DM was just another player at the table. Right. They're not, no, right? Yeah. And so trying to, I think you should be able to pull out Dungeons and Dragons and play it just like you would pull out, I don't know, Monopoly or Clue or something.
Sure.
But that is sadly not the case, right? So, or at least certain people, don't want to pick up and be the game master, just kind of on a spur of the moment. So that's kind of what some of my, thoughts and ideas were. It's just like, hey, if the opportunity arises and you want to show somebody D&D, nobody should be afraid to run the game.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like, I think we might be able to get it closer to at least like these micro RPGs that are practically zero prep, like Lady Blackbird or Honey Heist, where they have everything on like one page you need to like sit down with your friends and you roll on a few random tables and it tells you just enough to kind of get started. And you sort of hand the character sheets out and you're off to go. I think we can get closer to that. And I think some people have gotten it closer to that. But it's still, I mean, we also pick D&D, and D&D is a pretty meaty game. It's got kind of a lot going on. So, it's a little tricky. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, I guess one of my own self-criticisms kind of about the no prep game master approach that I like to take is that I do forget that I have been playing the game since I was 9 years old.
Right. So, yeah. Right.
And then I've played other ones as well. And so I usually
I'll tell you though, I'm pretty sure the 30-year prep DM is not a big selling title, right? Like all you have to do is for 30 years play D&D, and then you can play without any prep.
Exactly. Yeah, that was I crossed that one off my title list when I was thinking of titles. I crossed that one off.
30 years, nope. 29 years, nope. No. 28 years, nope.
No. The no prep. There you go. So,
no prep. I'll just take it all the way to zero.
Yes, take it all the way. But so that would be, kind of one of my criticisms, my self-criticism, that I forget sometimes that, if you're just new to the whole thing, a whole session or a whole campaign might just not pop into your head, right. Because I am used to that.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I wrote a book called Sly Flourish's Dungeon Master Tips. So I've written sort of a whole bunch of books before Lazy Dungeon Master. They're all relatively small, small to like 40 or 50 page sort of things. Mm-hmm. And one of them was Sly Flourish's Dungeon Master Tips, which is mostly about 4th edition D&D, but it was kind of about D&D in general. Some of the tips still hold well and some don't. And I considered that sort of like my book for new DMs, right? Like this was advice that I was giving people who were just kind of getting into it. Back in 4th edition, there weren't a lot of new people that were just getting into it, but it was sort of there. And then I considered the Lazy Dungeon Master a more advanced book. So I think like in the beginning, I said like my expectation for the people that are going to get value from this are people who have probably run, a good number of games, like in the teens to, like somewhere between 10 and 50 games. Enough to understand all the basic rules and how the game works. And then this stuff can kind of sit on top. And what was interesting is I got lots of DMs who wrote me that said, I had never played any games before and read your book, and it helped me figure out how to play. And I was like, well, that's unexpected. Like I considered it a relatively advanced book because it stripped so much away. I was like, the stuff I'm stripping away is stuff that you can strip away when you're experienced. But people resonated enough with the general ideas that even though they didn't have the things to kind of fill in those blanks, it was still enough for them to go. So like with Return, I said, it's, it can help you no matter what your experience level is, because they told me it can, right? Like, so yeah, I think that, now we actually have lots of new DMs, right? Like, yeah. I forget, there've been a couple places I go. There's like a DM Academy Reddit Discord server where you tell it like what your experience level is, and like 4/5 of them have played in the last 1 to 2 years, like started playing in the last 1 to 2 years. Mm-hmm. And it's now that's a selected group, right? Yeah, but that's still pretty amazing. Like for a group called the DM Academy, where you'd think like it'd be all a bunch of old people getting together talking about THAC0, and instead it's like it's a mostly new DMs, and they're picking up the stuff and going with it. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, we're definitely in a golden age, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah, just adding new players all the time.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Like going to Reddit and seeing people that are like, hey, I'm just getting started and I need help is like one of my favorite posts. And I have like a template that I give them, which of course is like, you should listen to me, but like, well, you did ask, and and there are other people here, right? So like I can go ahead and say, hey, here's my suggestions.
Yeah. And it is just interesting, for me too. It's just there were parts, or times during high school where I would just not meet anybody who played for a long time, and and if I ran into a person who played, they're like still my friends, right?
Yeah.
Because we were just like, oh my gosh, I need players, I need a DM or whatever, and now it's just exploded, which is, I know, it was just awesome. I just love it too, and so glad to see so many people coming into the hobby and being willing to pick up and run games for their friends. It's just really cool.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we talked about, Dungeon Master advice there a bit. As you've alluded to, you also do a lot of other books. Something that you recently did is called Fantastic Lairs.
Yeah.
Why don't you break that down for us and let us know what that is?
Sure. So in the beginning of 2020, when everything looked bright and beautiful that year, relatively speaking, myself and my friend James Intercasso, who has written in a lot of Wizards of the Coast hardcover adventures, probably at least a half a dozen of them, and my friend Scott Fitzgerald Gray, who has edited almost all of the D&D hardcover books, and many of them. I knew them two separate paths, but I was talking to them, and I think it was James who said, hey, sometime if you'd ever like to work on a project together, I'd love to work on one with you. And I'm like, what, are you kidding me? Like, let's start, right? Like, I'm ready, and he's the busy one. So I'm like, sure. And I said, let's talk to Scott. Right. And so I talked to Scott, and we all got together and said, yeah, we're going to do something. Right. And we had no idea what we were going to do, but we're like, we got a designer. We have, two designers and an editor on board that have a lot of experience writing on D&D stuff. How can this go bad? And it didn't, right? It's been a wonderful experience the whole time. So the three of us got together and we kind of kicked around ideas. And one of the things that stuck with us was a book that was made during the 4th edition era called Dungeon Delves. And Dungeon Delves was a book of 30 small 3-room dungeons for 4th edition that you could sort of drop in anywhere. And again, they were built in 4th edition style. So they were these big 2-page spreads with a tactical map and token representations and stat blocks and everything else sort of wired in, which isn't how 5th edition works. But we liked that, it had been continually brought up as like you remember Dungeon Delve? Oh yeah, I love Dungeon Delve. And we said, like, is there something like that for 5th edition? And there wasn't anything that Wizards of the Coast had put out that was like that. The closest they had come were some of the books that had like older adventures that they'd republished. So like Tales of the Yawning Portal and Ghost of Saltmarsh a little bit. Ghost of Saltmarsh is kind of between a campaign and a book of adventures, and Dungeon of the Mad Mage with all the different dungeon levels. But those were really kind of different than we were looking at. And we kind of refined on this and said, like, well, what more can we look at? And what's the hard part? A question I always ask myself all the time is, what's the hard part of DMing right now? Like, what's eating people's lunch? What's getting in the way? What's the barrier between pulling a board game off the shelf and just sitting up and playing and where we are today, right? And one of the things that I got into in return is like, you can kind of improvise combat encounters in 5th edition a lot of the time, unless it's a boss fight. And boss fights, you really want to spend a lot of time and attention on. You want to have a lot of interesting things happen. You want waves of combatants. You want interesting environments. So those still take time. So it's like, well, what if we made a book of just boss fights, and we'll scale them for all levels of play. And, we'll get good artists on board, and we'll get good cartographers on board, and we'll play test the hell out of them. We'll write them, we'll write them and then pass them to the others. So all three of us will be working on every one of these things. And so that's what we said we were going to do. And it sounded like a really good idea. And we commissioned some art and got a sample together and sort of got it ready. And then we kickstarted it, not right after COVID, but it was it wasn't great timing. Like, but it wasn't, there's no great timing last year to do something. Like the world's on fire a lot of times. And so, we were like 1 week out from like, major events that had just occurred. And we're like, are we really going to be like, yeah, we're sorry that, there's riots going on in the city streets, but hey, we have a book of boss battles. Right. And so, but we did, we're like, look, people need the escape, and there's never going to be a good time. The world's going to be on fire for a while. So there's not going to be a great way for us to do this. And we can do it with the respect, recognizing that a lot of people are very angry and in a lot of pain, and we need to try to help do what we can. Mm-hmm. So we put it out, and we did a Kickstarter, and the Kickstarter did well and funded the product. And we were going to start off with 10 boss battles, but because of how the Kickstarter did, we ended up with 23. And they were all levels of play from first to 20th level. We have 2 20th level Lairs, and every one of them is built around like a small, 3-ish room map with a preset boss fight, and then lots of advice and lots of dials for how to convert that boss fight and make it useful for something for your game. So they're not full adventures. They have hooks in and out. So they have like, here's where you can integrate this encounter into your campaign, and then here's where this campaign can lead to on the way out. So they sort of have this interface on both sides that make it easy to drop into a game. We had more, I think we had like 400 playtesters.
Oh, wow.
So we had a lot of playtest groups that went through all of them. I think there were a couple, most of them had like 5 to, in some cases 10 or 12 playtests for each layer. And then, we tried to aim for 5 for all of them. And I think there's only a couple that didn't quite get 5. And it was like 19th level big ass Lairs that were just hard to run anyway. Mm-hmm. So, and also very swingy no matter what. So it's like you could play test them, and some people like, our group wiped out in the first round, and the other group's like, we totally kicked its ass. And you're like, okay, I don't know what to do about this. So those dials that make it sort of easier or harder, those dials get really big in the end. We're like, you might, this dragon, the way we wrote it, does 140 damage on a breath weapon. You may turn that down to like 40. Or you might turn it up to 280. It really depends on your group. Mostly it depends if you have a paladin or not. So, so we did a lot of playtesting and spent the year working on it, worked really hard on it. And it went out to backers right at the end of the year, right before December. The PDF of it went out, and the physical copies, the galleys and everything for the physical copies were done, and it went up for full sale. I think last week. I think it was last week.
That would be February, right? Beginning of February.
Right at the beginning of February is when all of it was like all the print on demand versions are ready, and the main book is ready. And we still have a couple of rewards to give to the backers that I think will also be included with the digital copy for those who've already bought it, and it'll just be updated, and they'll get an email saying, hey, you can get the updates. And so we reached out to a lot of people in the community to build what we call campaign seeds, which are like take one of the Lairs and then build a larger campaign around it in like a short 1 to 3 page or about 2 or 3 page, document that sort of fires off your imagination and makes these things even more useful. So we have, I think, 10 or 12 of those that are going to come out as well, and that'll be added to everybody's purchase.
Nice.
Yeah, really fun project.
Yeah, it sounds awesome. And I've interviewed James here on the podcast.
Yeah, James is awesome.
Yeah.
He's my hero.
And you're right when you say he's busy. Every time I see something, he's doing some other like huge, amazing projects.
Yeah, well, now he's full-time employed over at Matt Colville, Matt Colville's company, MCDM. So he's now I think he's the managing editor for Arcadia, their big new magazine that they do over there.
Yeah.
So it's awesome.
Yeah, that was really cool. So getting back to the book a little bit, what makes a great boss fight in 5e?
That's a good question. So it's you want a boss fight to keep people on the edge of their seat without making them feel hopeless. So there's this whole idea in D&D and probably I think Robin Laws sort of captured it best in the book Hamlet's Hit Points of pacing in D&D. And like Monty Cook has said, but Monty Cook, one of the lead designers of the 3rd edition of D&D, and now runs his own company, Monty Cook Games. He said that learning how to do pacing is maybe the most useful skill that a DM can learn, and then doesn't give you a whole lot about how to do it. At least in the articles I've read with him, I was like, you told me what to do, but not how. I don't know how to do that. But Robin Laws says, here's how to do it. And he So in Hamlet's hit points, he basically describes it as an oscillation of upward and downward beats. You want good things to happen and bad things to happen and good things to happen and bad things to happen. You want this constant up and down. What you don't want is too many downward beats and you feel hopeless and like, you feel despair. And for a player, you'll be like, this sucks and I don't want to play. And if it's too many good beats, it's too easy and you're just going through the motions. There's no real skill. There's no real challenge. And so D&D overall works really well when you have these sort of upward and downward beats. You get in a dungeon, you fall in a trap, then you go and you find a treasure. You go and you face 2 ogres and it's really hard, but then you find there's a fountain behind them that can heal your hit points that you lost. So you have these sort of up and down beats. And boss fights need to have that continually during a boss fight. So we want to make sure that bosses are hard, but also beatable. And I think that's why like these fit multi-phased bosses that are suddenly becoming a thing. We have a bunch of multi-phase bosses in Fantastic Lairs. D&D, they call them mythic monsters. Mythic Odyssey of Theros was the first book that I think had them published.
Would you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So it's basically monsters have 2 phases. So phase 1, you'll beat them down, and then when their hit points are depleted, they suddenly turn into their phase 2 version. Very common in video games. A lot of times you'll see video games where you beat a boss, and sometimes it's a drag, right? Like sometimes it's like I'm thinking of like I was playing Sekiro, the Dark Souls kind of game, and it's like you're fighting a guy and you get past his second stage, he has a third stage. You're like, oh come on, like I'm so tired of fighting this guy. So it's not always great. But in D&D, you can do a lot of neat things. So we have monsters, I think mostly in the higher tiers is when we really did the multi-phase bosses. So like, I have a Marilith boss in one of them, and she's fighting with a bunch of swords, and she has these flying swords all around her that she can target at people. But then when she knocks down to her second phase, all the swords surround her and create this aura around her that's just chewing up everybody in it. And then you got to beat her again, but you can't really get to her because there's all these blades. So, the fun things like that. So having that as sort of an upward and downward beat. The upward beat is you're beating her, and then the downward beat is suddenly she switches to her next phase, and then the upward beat is beating her again. So that pacing a boss fight is really important, and making sure you have those upward and downward beats. Having an interesting environment to fight in that's not just a big empty room is always good. Having an environment that changes, like having it where parts of the floor fall out and now you got lava that you got to worry about. Think about like gladiatorial fights where the arena is constantly changing. We actually have a gladiatorial fight in the book where the arena constantly changes. And and then another good one is waves of monsters. So, you go in and then wave 1 hits you and you fight off wave 1, and then wave 2 comes in and you get rid of wave 2, and then finally the bosses show up. That technique works, and it works again because you're oscillating you're oscillating your upward and downward beats. And then another one, which we promote heavily in the book, we have it in the beginning of the book, and then we talk about it a lot in each chapter, is a concept that I call the dials. And if you look at any monster design in 5th edition, the hit points are actually variable. They have a listed average, but that's not set in stone. And instead, they have the hit dice of the monster right there. And the monster's actual hit points can be anywhere from the lowest to the highest amount that could roll on those hit dice. And so one of the dials that a DM has at their disposal is the ability to say, this monster actually has more hit points than the listed, or it has less hit points than the listed. And the really dirty secret is you can change it during the fight. Right. And no one wants to say it. And people, of the hate that I've received, it's mostly about this.
Yeah.
That, you're cheating if you're changing hit points. Like, why do we even have hit points if you're changing it halfway through? But the reality is at the table, no one cares, because most of the time you're churning it the other direction. Most of the time you're like, it's already boring and nobody wants to keep fighting this stupid thing. Yeah. So the next hit kills it. Right. Mm-hmm. And it's a commonly used trait. And it's funny because I've seen DMs who are kind of like, I have to play by the book, who will then skip entire encounters because like, well, we don't have time, and you're like, wait a minute, like if you're going to cut a whole encounter, you could have cut the hit points. Right. So that's one dial. Another dial is the damage dial. How much damage do monsters do? And can you scale that up? If it's like, well, they're hitting, but boy, everything is mitigating their damage. We're just going to make it a little harder. The number of monsters, you can have another wave of monsters show up, or you could have a bunch of monsters run away. And that, that's another big dial. One I like is number of attacks, where sometimes a monster just gets an extra attack, and it's like, wow, this thing's hitting a lot harder because now it's suddenly hitting me twice. And sometimes it's okay because you're like, oh, it's not so bad with this guy. And then it's a mummy and you're like, oh man, mummies do 20 points of damage a hit. And I just turned it into 40. So there are some where, the dial has to be tweaked just a little bit. And there's other times where you tweak it and it's like a really big difference.
Yeah.
So that's another sort of tool that we talk about heavily in this book, but it's transportable to basically everything is what, think about you as the DM, again, like the man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz. You got a bunch of levers and you got a bunch of dials, and out front, they're like sitting there talking to Oz, the great and powerful. And you're just twisting those dials, and hit point dial going up and down and the damage dial going up and down. And, so that I think you pack all that together and you could probably work a good boss fight out of that.
Yeah.
That's what we tried to do.
Yeah, some awesome stuff there. I'd like to follow up on a few things. I know I've heard the GM is cheating thing a few times for hit points and for fudging rolls and things. And usually my response is all right, well then you're running the campaigns for the next 3 years, right?
Yeah, right. Or like, hang on, here's this Excel spreadsheet you can use. Yeah. Right? Like you don't need me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's just like, okay, well, you run the games and I'll play and we'll see how it works or whatever. But
yeah, I mean, I remember running a game at an organized play thing, and I changed up the spells that a monster had. Like there was a necromancer or something, and I switched out his spells, and he cast a different spell, not like a higher power one, just a different spell on the list. And the guy's like, that guy doesn't have that on his spell list. And I'm like, well, how would you know, for one? Yeah. And two, he's not the same guy, is he? Right? Like, you don't get to choose. And I did. I think I told him, like, you can just replace me in the spreadsheet if you really want. Like, you don't need, if you know this guy enough that you know what spells he has memorized, you don't need me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I know.
To play devil's advocate on myself, right, on my own ideas, it's just you don't want to do it too often, and you certainly don't want people to know you're doing it. Yeah. Right. So, like a lot of times, and for normal monsters, most of the time, I'll run them with the average, and I'll try to stay to it. You don't want to tweak it too much. You want those dials to have resistance when you're turning them. And most of the time I will turn them down just because it's time for the battle to be over, and it's rare. Every so often I'll turn them up the other way. And a lot of times, and a lot of DMs have done this, which they assume they're maxed out and then they always lower them. Right. Yeah. And that can work too. If you say like, I know I'm going to be using a troll, and I know I'm making this up. I don't know if it is, but I know it normally starts with 55 hit points, but I'm giving it 85. I'm going to give them all 85. And then if I need to, I can always lower them. Yeah. And you're still cheating, but it's different than cheating on dice rolls, right? Like, so I will roll in the open. Like I'm still rolling attack rolls. I just might be rolling more of them. So it's like, there's so many other areas to cheat. You don't need to cheat on the rolls. You can cheat all on this other stuff,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know it was a few months ago when I was still running the game, I had the Kraken show up, but my players were too powerful. So I upped the armor class to like 24 and the hit points to like 600. Yeah. And it gave, of course, one of my players like has everything memorized.
Yeah. And at the end looks at you with a narrowed eye, right?
Yeah. But, at the end, he was like, hey, that was way more powerful than the Kraken is. And I was like, did you have fun? He was like, yeah, it was awesome. Like I wouldn't have had it. I wouldn't have had it any other way. Right. Cause they would have just defeated it pretty quickly.
Yeah. There's something about giving it like, it's a named Kraken. So like, I don't know if you've seen Slarkrathal, the Kraken in Storm King's Thunder.
But I haven't.
So it's a Kraken that has 20th level spellcasting abilities.
Oh gosh.
And so it's literally a Kraken that can cast Power Word Kill and does.
Oh gosh.
So there's, if everything has a name, right? If everything's a named creature. So like I had, I was running an Eberron campaign, and I had these these war trolls, right? Well, a war troll is a troll with a higher armor class, but if I call it a war troll, I could pretty much change it any way I want, and no one could say, "Well, that's not how a troll works." I'm like, "These aren't trolls; these are war trolls, right? Like, whole different thing. Like these have been trained to fight you. These are not a bunch of dudes in a swamp."
Yeah, absolutely. And then another thing you'd mentioned, which I think sometimes will be an area that I will be lacking when I'm running my no prep games is, we're having the boss fight and it's really cool. I tend to, on occasion, forget about the environment.
Oh yeah. It's
it's just so easy.
Forget about everything.
Yeah. It's just so easy to like kind of let the environment like, slip out of my mind because I'm focused on these spells that he can cast or whatever it is, I'm thinking about like 28 other things. And then I'm like, oh man, I was going to introduce this moss that was on the ground and it was going to grab their feet. And I totally forgot about that.
But it works out, right? Like in the end, like they're happy and it's like, I've totally forgot about that. Yeah. I think, I don't know. Do you play Theater of the Mind or do you play with a battle map?
Theater of the Mind all the way.
All right. So it's easy to forget about environments when you don't have an environment.
Exactly.
And I speak of this as a Theater of the Mind guy, right? Like I much prefer Theater of the Mind. Yeah. It's pretty easy. And there's some tricks from like Fate, the role-playing game Fate Core. And now they have a Fate Condensed. I think this is the latest version. And they have sort of environments and they have a thing called aspects, which are like aspects of an environment that the characters can use or even the villains can use. And they'll just write it on like a 3x5 card and drop it on the table. So you have this like big note that says like gripping moss, right? And it's like, it's right there in front of you. But yeah, like there's so many moving parts for these big fights that it's really easy to miss it. And in the end, it's like, you do, and it's okay. Right. Yeah. But yeah, it's a trick. And yeah, particularly in low prep and no prep. It's interesting that like, you play Theater of the Mind and I play Theater of the Mind. And I think Theater of the Mind definitely is the low prep, low prep style. Like I've got friends that I adore who talk about like, oh, I took 3 hours to prep my game. I'm like, how long is your game? Like 4 hours. I'm like, you spent 3 hours prepping for a 4-hour game? And like, yeah, it was all in Roll20, right? Like I had to get all those maps ready and I had to get all the lighting effects ready and get all the tokens ready and I tie all the stat blocks to all the tokens. I'm like, oh my God. And I just nod and smile. And like, I know, don't tell me about your Theater of the Mind. I know, but and they don't want to hear about it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, well, you know the problem.
Yeah. I mean, when I was 16, I could spend 4 hours, prepping a game. But, when I have, a wife and kids and things, I mean, it's just, I mean, if I get 3 hours, let's play. Right. That's my playing time. Right.
Yeah. I think when it comes to like boss fights is one of the areas where I'll actually try to spend a little bit more time. And even still, like I ran a great big conclusion to a campaign that I ran just recently. And I still don't think I didn't spend anything close to that. But I did have a battle map and I did have tokens and I did have all that stuff, but I use a whole different tool that's a little easier to use. And it still didn't spend that kind of time. Like I haven't spent that kind of time, I don't know, in a long time.
Yeah. And now that we, my group and I were playing on Roll20, even though we live like, 10 or 15 minutes away from each other.
The same way. Yeah.
Yeah.
My wife and I play, we have a one-on-one game where we're in the same room and we still play with online tools.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Because it's just like, it's become second nature. Like all of our games have gone online now and we're just used to it. And all the tools are there and everything else. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah. I know my maps on Roll20 are basically like a rectangle room.
Right. I just go steal Dyson logo maps. Like, those are my go-to maps.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Or I was going to say, yes, either I'll draw a rectangle or I'll just grab some map online and say, okay, well, you're here. And this is what it looks like. All right. Well, Mike, I've had you on now a long time. I didn't even get to ask you about podcasts, right? You have a couple podcasts at least, right?
Really just one now.
Okay.
Well, it's so complicated.
I used to listen to your deep dive. I don't know if you still do that one.
I do. I actually just had a new I had a pseudo deep dive episode. And then I had an actual coming back to the deep dive. So, so the main podcast, and it's now, I think if you go onto any of your podcast channels and look for it, it's called Sly Flourish's Lazy DM Prep, because that's mostly what I'm doing these days. But if you look for Sly Flourish on it, you'll find it on any of your favorite podcatchers. And so I was doing a podcast, the DM's Deep Dive, for the Don't Split the Podcast Network, which was the network that James Intercasso and Rudy Basso ran. They have since this summer, they stepped away from it. And by the end of the year is when kind of everybody that was on that network sort of went off in their separate ways. Most of them had already been running their own podcast, so it was mostly just not being syndicated as part of the Don't Split podcast feed. I, on the other hand, was depending on them for all of the stuff because I'm lazy and I don't want to do all that work. So Rudy was doing all the back end work on that. And so he's like, hey, here it is back. So I had already been doing another podcast called the Lazy DM Prep Show, where on Sunday mornings, I go on Twitch, and a lot of people would say like, hey, this Return to the Lazy Dungeon Master thing looks great, but I don't know. I want to see you do it. Like, I don't know how it's done. And I'm like, oh, I could do that, right? Like I have a Sunday D&D game. I will get on Twitch and I will spend an hour on Twitch prepping for my game. And you can see me use the steps and see how it relates directly to this campaign that I'm running. And then I'll use that for my own prep. And so that way I was already doing the prep anyway. So it was easy to fit into the schedule. And then I would take the results from that and record it and put it up on YouTube. And then also put it up as a podcast. And now, just a few weeks ago, we merged those two podcast feeds. And as a guy who runs podcasts, you can imagine what that was like when you're shuffling. Here, I have 150 episodes of this podcast and 150 episodes of this other podcast. And we're going to literally shuffle them like a deck of cards. And we did, and nobody has yelled at me yet. So I'm like, yeah, I got some people like, it looks like the feed changed. And I'm like, if that's all you had a problem with, great. Because what I was worried about is like, it looks like my phone exploded because, 150 gigabytes worth of data just shot down all at once. Yeah. So like we put up a warning episode saying, hey, the feed's going to change. Make sure you have your thing set to the most recent 3 so that you don't get all these other episodes that you never saw before. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the DM deep dive is a show much like this one where I'll bring on a guest and we'll pick a particular topic like running Theater of the Mind combat, right? Mm-hmm. And we will dive deep into that topic, and do that. Those are harder to do. They're harder to schedule. So I don't do them nearly as often again because I'm lazy. And as far as for me, like I could just go downstairs and turn on my mic and talk, right? Like that's easy. So now it's all kind of gone down to that one podcast. The other podcast I'm on, though, is a show that my friend Jeff Greiner runs as part of the Tome Show Network called Behind the DM Screen. And that's myself and Jeff Greiner and Sam Dillon once a month talk about our games and what's been going on with our games and then get advice from the other two about where to go in the games in the future. So I'm still doing that one as well. And then on the main Sly Flourish feed, I also do these like one-off advice episodes. So I did one on safety tools and I did another one on, I don't think I published the Owlbear Rodeo one there, but like I'll do one on how to get Discord set up to run D&D games and stuff like that.
I think I saw the Owlbear Rodeo.
Yeah. So most of the time they're on YouTube and I don't take them if they're heavily visual, I don't bother to make them a podcast. So like Owlbear Rodeo, it's like, you're going to hear me clicking a lot. That's not really handy. But yeah, the main thing I'm doing, and again, laziness on my part, is I try to get everything to be able to go to all the platforms as often as possible, which usually means they're kind of crummy on certain ones. So like I before Rudy Basso was editing my Lazy DM prep stuff, and now no one is editing them. They go up raw. And, we'll see, right? People are like, wow, there's like 20 seconds of dead air. I thought something was wrong. And I'm like, yeah, sorry. I was thinking, which makes for great podcasts. Yeah. So, but I love it. Like, I love Twitch. I love going on Twitch. And now everybody, not everybody, the people who care. A lot of people have come and said, boy, we'd love you to stream your games. And I'm like, well, first of all, my games are my games, right? They're not a show. And I don't have a cast. These are my friends. And, it's not nearly as interesting as people think, right? Like, if you want to know what my game is like, look at your own game. It's probably a lot like that, right? Like we're all playing D&D. There's nothing special. So I have like one series where I did a one-on-one game with my friend Enrique Bertrand, the newbie DM. And whenever anybody asks if I ever stream my games, I go, here, there's 10 episodes. It's all of Dragon of Icespire Peak. You can watch us do it. It was super fun to do. We loved it. I'd love to do it again, but as like editing shows takes a long time, and I just don't have the time. So it's like you could get raw, anything that I could squeeze out of myself without actually burning any more time, you can get, and anything else you can't, right? Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. And so you talked about your podcast. Where can people find your books?
Slyflourish.com. So everything. Any of the stuff that you want to find, books or videos or podcasts or whatever, if you go to the front page of slyflourish.com, there's links to all of the things there. There's links to all of my favorite articles from the site. There's links to all the most recent articles on the site. So that one, I just recently rebuilt the homepage. It still holds on to the title as most boringly designed RPG homepage. But its design is like, here's articles, right? Here's articles and links. So I really wanted it to be just a one site where you can go and get everything. So all the books are there. Spend a good couple of minutes reading what's there, and you can pretty much find anything you want.
Okay, and I will make sure that I provide links to your website and to I'll pull out some of your books and your podcasts and provide links to those in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So if you are listening to this episode, you can just head over to dicegeeks.com and you will find the show notes, and you can find all of Mike's awesome books and his podcasts. Well, Mike, it was a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, no, pleasure to be on it. Thank you very much for inviting me.
All right, there you have it, guys. Oh, I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Mike. I had a ton of fun talking to him today. If you want to learn more about Mike and his RPG products, I have placed links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com, where you will find fantastic Lairs, The Lazy Dungeon Master, The Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, and some other works by Mike. You want to check them out, seriously. All right, now guys, hey, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you'll get an email update from me letting you know what is going on in the world of Dice Geeks. Also, guys, if you want to support this show financially, that would mean the world to me. You can head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks and learn about different options to support the show. And if you decide to do that, I will offer you eternal gratitude. I just want to thank you so much for listening to the show today. And until next Wednesday, keep gaming.